Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communication.
Hi, Ro. I hope you're awake after listening to the very long State of the Union address.
Well, Tim, what did you think? I'll let you have the first shot.
I think some of it was kind of the standard State of the Union stuff. We go through the laundry list of all the different things we've done and the different things that we want to do. I did think that, and I don't know if it was because of the optics of the speech or if it's just Biden as a speech maker, having fewer people in the room. I think they said there was something like 200-ish people there, where usually there's about 1,600 packed in, led to kind of fewer applause lines and, or more slower applause lines. And I thought he kind of tripped over some of those big natural applause lines. And again, it could have been just from fewer people. You didn't get that normal rousing round of applause. And he has a style kind of racing through everything too. And given how long his speech was, I can see why. I thought when he was going through the COVID and stimulus stuff, I think rhetorically, he's hoping for the 2021 equivalent of his famous line, bin Laden is dead and GM is alive. And I think that the speech suffered from that throughout, looking for that kind of line. But I think overall, it really was kind of a rambling laundry list. And on whatever he was talking about, whether it was infrastructure or jobs or all his clean energy plans, he said a lot of stuff and he said it'll create jobs or it'll be good or it will do this. But it really suffered from any explanation of why or how. And that being said, I think it kind of rings hollow overall as just kind of political talk.
Well, I have to agree with you on the setting with all the members of Congress. They're 6 feet apart. Only a fraction of them were there. They were all masked, despite what I think they're probably all fully vaccinated. So you would think, given that setting, that it was one of the darkest days of the pandemic, that the pandemic was still raging. And I think if you wanted to encourage people to get the vaccine, I think Congress should have set an example. I think the way they set the speech may have showed some distrust among the American people about whether a vaccine is going to be effective. I agree with you. I thought his speech was full of cliches. America is on the move again. We can't stop now. America is ready to take off. There's nothing we can't do if we work together. That's the kind of writing that could get you stacked as a speechwriter, frankly. I mean, who writes that stuff? And I heard a lot of these goofy lines and they were sprinkled all over the speech.
Yeah, there were a lot of throwaway lines. Healthcare is a right. The wealthy and corporations should pay their fair share. I really thought it kind of, when you use that kind of really throw a lot of blaming your predecessor. If the premise of your speech is, we want to appeal to the middle, we want to promote coming together. Well, when you use lines like that, how are you appealing to the other side to come over to? You're really kind of putting a thumb in the eye. That part where he really called out the Senate GOP on gun legislation, how does that bring them together? When he says, this is not a Democrat or Republican issue, this is an American issue. Well, does that make it so just because he said it? The other line that really I thought was, that tied rhetoric was when he said no amendment is absolute to the Constitution. I think it is. That's why it's in the Constitution.
Well, in terms of making the case to the American people, I mean, he stood there like he was Santa Claus in springtime. This group gets this, and I'm doing this thing for that person, and I'm spending X for this project and that project. But he doesn't make the case that it's actually tax dollars that are creating these jobs. It's not any kind of organic growth of the economy. So, I mean, as think tankers, I think we have our work cut out for us, because this money that Biden plans to spend or hopes to spend is really taxpayer dollars. And it's not money that's coming down from trees. Well, Americans have to be careful about that. And we got to make the case.
Well, the other thing, too, is that I thought it was rich that Biden was calling out the Trump tax plan and the debt when you consider his own plan. And I think that was another challenge with his speech, that there was a lot of criticism of the predecessor and the economic record of the last 4 years. But I think that's actually a tough sell. I think most regular people know the Trump economy, other than obviously affected by COVID, was good for them. And then when you look at where we are numbers wise today, we're not in a Great Depression. So just kind of on its face, I didn't feel like he made the case for why we need a New Deal on steroids type of program. The other thing, too, that I thought was interesting was on some of the key points, especially when he was talking about the American Families Plan, which is the most liberal, I would say, of his three big programs. For example, he couched it in terms of global competition. Now, that's smart to do that. That's a reasonable point to make. But the reality is, we've been saying a lot of things in terms of we need to compete with the world, but yet our schools are still falling behind. There is no mention of school or teacher accountability or helping kids escape from failing public schools that aren't preparing them to compete with the world. And then again, when you talk about we can afford it, we know how to do this, you don't say how. And it just leads, I think, most folks to believe, well, this is just kind of a political line in a speech. It's not, reality.
And I hope people take a step back and really think about what he's saying. Just one more point on style points. President has to this kind of scolding, lecturing style. And now he's got this new affectation where he's actually whispering to the mic. You can't pull off a whisper on a mic. That's not what a mic is for. It's there to broadcast your voice in a loud way. Overall, I thought his delivery was poor. I think even in the end, he was starting to fade, starting to look tired, mumbling at times. And it is 10 p.m. I mean, I'd be tired if I had to give a speech at 9:30, 10 o'clock. So I would suggest to their speech writers or communications people that he probably ought to start earlier.
I agree. There are many things that are broadcast on television that I find myself saying, why is this on so late? And we're on the West Coast, so imagine being on the East Coast. I don't know why we couldn't have this as a noontime address.
Well, anyway, let's move on to Tim Scott's speech. I thought it was terrific, but I thought I'll let you go first.
I think it was John Podhoretz I saw on Twitter yesterday say he felt it was perhaps the best response speech like this to a State of the Union or the State of the State that's ever been given. Now, I don't remember all of them, but this one certainly is right up there. I thought he was relatable and related to what real people are going through. I thought he gave perhaps the most powerful pitch for school choice I've ever heard. And I thought he made, a very effective case that Biden's agenda is not common ground.
I thought it was a terrific speech. I'm always down on these rebuttal speeches. I don't think that anyone comes off well, or at least no one in the past has come off well. And in fact, if anything, it's hurt their political career. But I thought he hit it out of the park. I thought his best line, I love this line, America is not a racist country. It's such a simple line, but seems like so many politicians are afraid to even say that these days. And I thought another great line, one that was very eloquent, was, quote, original sin is never the end of the story, not in our souls and not for our nation. The real story is always redemption. One of the most eloquent lines I've heard when it comes to describing America's slaveholding past, but also the progress that we've made against racism and hope for the future. So I thought that was a terrific line, and I think it's going to be remembered for a long time.
I do too, and he obviously is uniquely qualified as a Republican to talk about these issues, but the way he so powerfully called out the other side, he said that and pointed out, and rightfully so, that we forget about a lot in this debate over policing legislation. He had a perfectly reasonable bill ready to go last summer, and the Democrats, ironically, used the filibuster to block it. And I thought this was one of the best lines in his speech. They want the issue more than they want a solution.
Yeah.
The other thing, in all this talk about voting, which is obviously a key subject on Capitol Hill today, I thought again, say what you will about the issue, but I've not heard any Republican effectively communicate why the various bills in the different states are important. And he summed it all up in one word. Republicans support making it easier to vote, but harder to cheat. And I think if more Republican communicators should watch Tim Scott and learn how to communicate with authenticity like he does.
Well, turning to our podcast this week, our guest is Nolan Gray. He's a Ph.D. student at UCLA and a former urban planner. So we noticed Nolan from a terrific article he wrote for The Atlantic a couple of months ago now on California's housing crisis. We chat with Nolan about the housing shortage across the state, why housing is so expensive, why it's so expensive to build anything in the state. And of course, the main culprit is the California Environmental Quality Act, and that's going to be a big project for PRI this year, where we'll be offering recommendations on how to streamline CEQA and the permitting process this fall. What did you think of the interview, Tim?
I thought it was really interesting and timely and hits on key issues that are being debated once again in the legislature this year, and we'll see if there'll be any relief given to remove some of these, as Kerry Jackson has called it, legislative created obstacles to building homes in California. But it's certainly right out of the headlines today. Every day when you, I don't know that we open newspapers anymore. When you click on a newspaper online, you see a story of record housing prices, how fast and how competitive the bidding process is to buy a new home. And all of this is happening during COVID and during an economic downturn. So the importance of reforming these laws so we can streamline, get the additional housing we all know is needed to build, it's more important than ever. And I think he has some very interesting insight and good recommendations for lawmakers.
So we love to discover rising stars in the free market movement, and especially here in Next Round. So we're fortunate to have discovered Nolan Gray. We think you'll enjoy it. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Nolan, it's great to have you on Next Round to discuss California's housing crisis, which is a topic that PRI has done a lot of work on in recent years. For our listeners who may not be familiar with your work, tell us a little bit about your background and some of your research interests.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an incredibly important topic that we're discussing, and I'm glad you guys are active on it. My name is Nolan Gray. I'm a professional city planner. Right now, I research land use planning, so that's how we plan out our cities. I was a professional city planner in New York City. I'm now a Ph.D. student at the University of California, Los Angeles, so I'm kind of in the thick of it. And I'm an affiliated scholar with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where they explore market solutions for contemporary public policy issues.
Well, Nolan, as good Trojans, we will not hold your UCLA affiliation against you there. So you recently published a very provocative and interesting article in The Atlantic on how Californians are weaponizing the state's environmental laws primarily to stop much needed housing construction projects across the state. So to set the stage for our listeners, could you share a few examples that you found in your research of worthy projects that are being held up by state environmental laws?
Absolutely. Well, like so much of what's gone wrong in California, the idea of environmental review started out with good intentions, right? There were large-scale projects or state infrastructure projects that had caused a lot of unintended harm to, people who live near or were displaced by things like freeway construction or dam construction or large-scale industrial operations. And so the original intent of requiring this type of environmental review was well-meaning. But as I detail in the piece, what's happened over the last 50 or so years is that these environmental reviews are now applied to virtually everything that happens in the state of California. Not just if you want to build a dam and you're going to displace a lot of people or you're going to potentially affect the environment, but if you want to build a duplex in an existing urban area where there's incredible demand for housing, or if you want to redesign a street to maybe try to address traffic. And so it essentially just ends up throwing sand in the gears of any sort of necessary change or improvement in the state. And it makes ultimately things like housing much, much, much more expensive. So in the piece, I detail, a few cases of this where in many cases, nonprofits or even for-profit developers have tried to build the housing that the state already makes it so difficult to build, but they've actually faced, bad faith litigation by people exploiting some of these environmental review regulations that really weren't even adopted for this purpose.
So Nolan, in your article, you do a deep dive into the history of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and how it's become a weapon by opponents against various housing projects. Take our listeners through a bit of history. Just how has a very well-intentioned law become a tool to make it very difficult and very expensive to build housing in California?
As I mentioned, it was originally applied to government projects. So the idea was that if government was going to undertake maybe a large infrastructure project, or they were going to change an area in a meaningful way, they would have to undertake a full environmental study. And the idea here was that they would provide everyone involved with the relevant information, and then policymakers or state agencies could make decisions in full knowledge of how a particular project or initiative would impact the potential community. But a few things changed along the way. So one of the really important things with CEQA is that it's enforced by people litigating its provisions. So if a neighbor of an initiative doesn't feel like the environmental study was conducted extensively enough, or if the state agency didn't consider possible alternatives, they can take that agency to court and actually require them to revise what's called the environmental impact report. So this provision sort of lays the groundwork for problems later on when eventually these environmental reviews start getting applied to even private projects that require any form of government approval. So in the state of California, of course, local land use regulations are very, very, very strict. In many cases, you can't actually build anything as of right or without going to the government and asking for permission. So the effect has been that every time somebody wants to build something, maybe in a city like Los Angeles or San Francisco, where there's such a desperate need for more housing, or maybe to build a new subdivision in the suburbs across the state, they have to go to the government and ask for permission. And as part of this, they actually have to conduct, in many cases, a full environmental review. And this can take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then here's the real kicker. People who are opposed to the project can always come in at the last minute and threaten them with lawsuits or take them to court and extend the process by many years. And of course, all of this is translated into just higher fees for people who want to build things that the state needs, like offices, housing, apartments, etc.
PRI is working on a project on CEQA that'll be out later this year. And one of the things we're focusing on, and which you document in your article, are these voluminous environmental impact reports that you just touched on that housing project proponents must submit to. Give our listeners a sense of just how expensive and complex these environmental impact reports are.
Yeah, well, like with so much of the law, the environmental assessments and then eventually the reports started out fairly small, right? And looking at things that you would actually consider to be truly environmental impacts, right? Things like stormwater, things like noise generation. But because of the risk of litigation and the potential for a court to say, hey, you didn't consider all the impacts, these environmental reports in many cases have gotten incredibly long. So they'll require a team of experts all conducting studies on a whole bunch of different things, in many cases not really dealing with subjects that you would even normally associate with the environment. Things like traffic, or things like, cultural amenities, or things like how the character of a place might change. So nowadays you have environmental reports that have to consider all of these things. And so, of course, as you can imagine, these cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and in many cases they might take years to actually produce. And all of that is, an added cost that eventually shows up in the final product that Californians consume, resulting in, more expensive housing, more expensive office space, more expensive retail, all down the line.
At PRI's first annual California Ideas in Action Conference in 2018, we had the opportunity to hear from John Gamboa of the California Community Builders, and he argued that California's environmental laws were actually violating the civil rights of those who lived in minority communities, denying their ability to purchase an affordable home. What have you found in your research about how these CEQA lawsuits are impacting new housing in poor and urban neighborhoods?
Key to CEQA is that it's enforced by litigation. So if you try to build anything in an area where there's a lot of potential neighbors, odds are that one or two of them is going to be upset about maybe a new subdivision being built or a new apartment. So in many cases, this makes it actually very hard to build in some of the dense urban areas where housing is actually most needed. So the ironic result of CEQA is that it actually encourages more development to go pretty far out into the periphery of metropolitan areas, right? Out to green fields where there really aren't maybe a lot of neighbors to complain. Of course, the irony of this is that infill development in an existing urban neighborhood, maybe creating housing for lower income populations that don't want to be displaced out of a city, in many cases, it's actually much harder to build that more environmentally friendly housing than it is to build the ex-urban greenfield periphery development. So in this sense, like with so much of California policy, there's good intentions, but the actual results just don't bear out.
You write that even Habitat for Humanity projects have fallen victim to these CEQA lawsuits. Now, who could be against a Habitat for Humanity project? So share with our listeners what they ultimately had to go through to get their project back on track.
Right. Well, in the piece, I discussed the case of Redwood City, where exactly as you say, the Habitat for Humanity was trying to build a small multifamily building, accommodating working class folks in the Bay Area. And this would have been quite close to a local rail station, which takes people to lots of jobs. Of course, there's lots of jobs locally. And of course, one upset neighbor was able to drag them to court and delay the process and add, of course, quite a substantial amount of legal fees. And this is really a mechanism that threatens all forms of housing, particularly affordable housing. So if I have an axe to grind with a new development, I really only need a few $100s in my pocket and a few hours of my time, and I can extend the time it takes to get these projects built by potentially years.
Reading your article, Nolan, it seems like the proponents of these housing projects are jumping through hoops, every hoop imaginable, to try and satisfy the concerns of project opponents to no avail. Ultimately, what is motivating these lawsuits? Is it NIMBYism? Is it that they believe the ends justify the means? And how is it called greenmailing, making the problem of CEQA lawsuit abuse even worse?
It's a great question. I think in some cases, right, I think it probably is the case that people might have legitimate environmental concerns that they feel haven't been addressed. Ideally, an improved version of CEQA would create a space for those sorts of concerns to be considered. I don't think anyone's arguing with that. But I think where people have concerns are all of these frivolous lawsuits, which I think, as you mentioned, come from this sort of NIMBY attitude that many people in the state have, where they just don't want to see anything new happening near them, and they want to use the power of state regulation and onerous government process to block that new housing. When in reality, if they want something to not happen, they should maybe pay for the person to not build or buy the property themselves. So, part of this too, as you mentioned, there's this whole phenomenon of greenmailing where, so forget about legitimate environmental concerns, forget about even maybe garden variety NIMBYism. In many cases, developers actually find themselves facing, threats of lawsuits from people who are very specifically asking for money, right? So there's an alleged case where, one hotel developer was potentially facing these sorts of greenmailing threats where the person is essentially saying, hey, pay me off, or give me this, give my community this benefit that we want, or we're going to launch a CEQA lawsuit against you that's going to tie up the project for years. And of course, if you're a developer, you're staring down the barrel there, looking at, years of delays and hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional costs. Then in many cases, you'll just say, fine, I'll give it to you. Just leave me alone. Let me build this thing that the community needs.
Well, and aside from COVID-19, it seems like no issue has gotten more lip service in Sacramento in recent years than housing and homelessness. And even though you hear Democrats and Republicans alike talk of the need to address housing unaffordability, it's really easier said than done to pass these much-needed reforms. So what are some of the key reform measures that have been debated in Sacramento in recent years and ultimately blocked? And if you were made king of California for the day, what reforms would you implement?
That's a great question. Incredibly complicated. I mean, the state's affordable housing crisis is years in the making. And it really comes down to, in many cases, local regulations in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco, and of course, all the suburbs that make up those regions, just making it very hard for developers to build the housing that Californians need and want. So as a result, you have more and more Californians either staying and bidding up the price of the existing housing. If you have, a lot of people competing for a small pool of housing, the price is going to go up. You have a game of musical chairs. One person doesn't get a chair. But in many cases, people are just leaving the state. They're having to move to places like Idaho or Nevada or Arizona to find affordable housing. And then, of course, they're, in a sense, exporting the California housing crisis all across the Mountain West. It's going to take years to fix this problem. problem. But I think a really, really important part of the conversation that's happening right now is to need to clear away some of these rules that arbitrarily block new housing from being constructed, both within cities and in suburbs. So, one of the initiatives that's happened over the past few years has been the state saying to local governments that, hey, you need to come up with a way to allow what are called accessory dwelling units, or depending on where you are, they might be granny flats or mother-in-law units or casitas. These are essentially extra little units that homeowners can actually add in their basements or in their attics or in their garages, and they can actually take on a tenant. And this could be a family member, hence the colloquial name, mother-in-law units or granny flats, or they can just be a renter who helps them to defray the cost of the mortgage or their taxes and upkeep. So that's been one positive initiative. There's also been some discussion about the state setting standards for local governments in terms of how strictly they can regulate local housing markets. So saying particularly to some of these urban municipalities that are very, very, very strict and in many cases just very over-regulated, to say, hey, you need to allow more housing construction near existing job centers. Or if you have rail transit or if you have rapid bus transit in any form, you need to allow developers to actually build housing near those. You can't just say, we're going to block any new housing or we're going to try to squeeze as much revenue out of you as we can. The state desperately needs, hundreds of thousands of, if not millions of units to accommodate the demand. And that's even if nobody moved to the state of California. If you actually run the numbers and say, all right, just look at births and deaths and of the existing people who live in California, even if you just looked at that and you assume that nobody moved to California, which, for all its problems, California is a great place and a lot of people want to move here, for better or worse. You wouldn't even have enough housing to accommodate the people who currently live in California. And so what you're getting are, particularly in places like Los Angeles, where, we had that horrible COVID outbreak in January, you're getting these COVID outbreaks because in many cases, working class California families are forced to double, triple up. You have grandmothers and grandchildren having to share the same bedroom because we just haven't allowed enough housing to be built, which has driven this affordable housing crisis. So, at the root of the problem is how do we clear away some of these arbitrary regulatory barriers that block new housing construction? And I'm optimistic. We're seeing conversations happening at the local level and we're seeing conversations happen at the state level, but, we're not even halfway through this thing and it's going to be a major issue for the years to come.
So it seems like every day you open a newspaper and you read a story about how housing costs in Sacramento and Los Angeles and other parts of the state are reaching record highs. We're seeing bidding wars all over California. Given that our housing affordability crisis has grown even worse in recent months, do you think that the prospects for reform are any brighter this legislative session? What reforms currently being discussed do you think stand the best chance of passage?
It's a great question. Well, I'm not going to embarrass myself and try to read the political tea leaves. I'll leave that to the folks more involved in Sacramento. But I do think there are some exciting ideas that are floating around. So we've spent most of this conversation talking about CEQA. And, over the last few years and up until now, there has been a real conversation about, hey, why don't we just exempt some of these housing proposals from CEQA, right? The risk that maybe somebody building a duplex in an existing urban area, that's going to have any environmental impact is just so astronomically low that the idea that this should have to do a 500-page environmental review is just ridiculous. So one sort of idea has been to exempt more and more of the developments that the state needs from this onerous regulatory process. I know right now there's a bill in the legislature that would just say to universities, hey, if you want to add additional student housing, to relieve pressure, right? In a place like University of California, Los Angeles, or Berkeley, or San Diego, all across the state, in many cases, the universities don't have enough student housing. And so students have to go out and bid up the price of existing rentals. And that might, displace less affluent renters. So one way to fix this would be to add additional student housing. Of course, they bump into the CEQA problem. Anybody can sue them. Anybody can drag the process out. And we just can't build the housing fast enough. So one proposal floating through the legislature right now is to exempt these university student housing projects from CEQA. That's really exciting. I think another really exciting idea that's being discussed is to just set baseline allowances within areas that have, already have great transit. So in many parts of San Francisco and Los Angeles, the area might be well served by a subway, which the government's spending an incredible amount of money on, or a bus line, but then the surrounding area is zoned maybe only for, strip malls or low-slung single-family homes. And that might have been fine, at a time when California was still growing and still had a lot of new housing production happening on the periphery. But today, in many cases, those areas actually could accommodate more housing, and it's really government regulation that stops those homes from being turned into maybe a small apartment building or those strip malls, right? That's another thing. We talk about COVID. Coming out of this crisis, we don't know what's going to happen with retail. In many cases, shops and restaurants that closed might not come back, and you might have a lot of underused retail spaces that are along corridors that are served by buses and are near jobs. And you can say, all right, well, we're going to force that to remain a strip mall because the zoning says so. Or you can say, hey, okay, if a developer wants to come along and, maybe build apartments with, some shops or offices on the ground floor, we're not going to stop them from doing that. And so one idea that's floating in the legislature is to just say to cities, hey, you have to allow some level of construction near job centers and transit. And I think that's also a very exciting opportunity. And it's a very light touch way. It's not the government saying how things should and shouldn't be, but it's just saying, hey, you need to ease back on some of these rules that maybe are blocking developments that California needs.
So as we close, we have our favorite question that we ask all of our guests. We call our podcast Next Round because PRI's headquarters are located near wine country, and we love nothing more than discussing public policy with a glass of wine. So what wine, beer, adult, or otherwise beverage are you drinking these days when you just need to unwind from thinking about the mess that is California housing policy?
Oh, that's a great question. It's warming up in Los Angeles. I've been enjoying some light beers, right? Some ales and some lagers. I visited family in Kentucky just recently, and I brought back some Kentucky beers. But of course, there's lots of fantastic Californian beers, and so I've been trying to keep it light. Sit out on my porch and enjoy a nice light beer.
Is there one or two varieties that you recommend our listeners check out?
Well, if you're ever in Lexington, Kentucky, there's a little local brewery called West 6 Brewing. I'll admit that I did bring some beer back from there. I've been having the Vienna style lager, and it's fantastic when you're sitting out on these increasingly warm days.
Thanks so much, Nolan.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.